Good. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this evening's Great Decisions. We're having a few more people join us. Just give us a few more minutes. All right, it's past the hour. All right, I think we will start, and I know a few others are joining us, but I want to be respectful of time. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third in the 2021 Great Decisions lecture series. My name is Daniel Stoll. I'm Associate Dean for Global Affairs at St. Norbert, and along with my colleague at the University of Wisconsin Green Bay, Dr. David Corey, we welcome you to our program tonight on climate change and its impact on the Arctic. A few housekeeping details before we turn things over to our speaker. A reminder that, as always, this is a lecture that's being recorded. In the next 2 to 3 days, the recording will be available on the Great Decisions webpage for the Center for Global Engagement at St. Norbert. So if you know of someone who has missed this, or if you'd like to go back and listen again, that should be available certainly by Monday next week. For those of you who wish to ask a question following the presentation, we, as always, ask that you put it into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. We prefer that instead of the chat function because it's easier to monitor. So again, please put your questions in the Q&A. And then just as a reminder, our next lecture will be on Wednesday the 17th. Dr. Art Sear from Carthage will be talking about Brexit. But before we move forward with tonight's program, Dr. Curry, would you like to say a few words?
Sure, thanks Dan, and welcome everybody, students, faculty, and staff from St. Norbert and UW Green Bay, as well as the larger community. We're thrilled to have such a wonderful turnout tonight. As Dan said, for the third of our Great Decisions lectures, and we've had wonderful series of lectures so far, have 3 more coming up. So we invite you to check out the website and sign up for those, as we have some great discussions coming up to round out the series. It's a little bit unusual this year that we can't be in person, but it's been worked out very nice in that our audience and attendance have really been great, as have the questions. So we're very excited about tonight's speaker, as well as your questions towards the end. So Dr. Stoll, back to you.
Thank you. So as is our custom here at St. Norbert, we ask one of our students to introduce guest speakers. So I'd like to invite Calista Arendt, a junior here at St. Norbert, to do the honors this evening.
All right, I am pleased to welcome Dr. Rebecca McKean as our speaker this evening. Dr. McKean is an associate professor of geology at St. Norbert College. She did her undergraduate at St. Norbert College and her master's at Northern Arizona University. Dr. McKean earned her Ph.D. at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, where she studied the impact of climate change on dune fields throughout the Great Plains. Dr. McKean's areas of specialization are vertebrate paleontology and sedimentology. We are excited to hear Dr. McKean speak to us about the struggles in the melting Arctic.
All right, thank you so much. Welcome everyone. It's fun to look at the participants list and see a number of friends, family, former students, colleagues. So welcome everyone, and thanks for taking time out of your evening to learn about a topic that, I'll be honest with you, is not going to be the most uplifting topic, but I'd like to share with you some information about climate change and what's going on in the Arctic. So we'll start with just a really brief outline so you have an idea of where this talk is headed. So I'm going to cover really briefly just a few basics of anthropogenic or human-caused global climate change. Of course, I could spend an entire couple of hours talking about that, but we'll brief it down to just a little bit. I'll talk next, the bulk of my talk really will be on climatic changes in the Arctic. So what is really happening up there and how can we really think about it in terms of what we see here in Wisconsin? So I'll focus on those 4 topics that you can see listed on the slide. And I'll spend a little bit of time at the end talking about what are some of the implications of these big changes that we're seeing in the Arctic. And I'm going to focus on the things that are most relevant to me as a geologist. So I'll talk briefly about transportation routes in the Arctic, and then I'll spend some time talking about geologic resources in the Arctic. So let's get started. So if you have been one of my students before, you've heard a lot about anthropogenic global climate change and how it works, why it's happening. So I'm going to try to give just a really brief primer into that in case people haven't had that before. So the first thing, as a geologist, I like to look way back in the geologic record to really try to see if what we're seeing today compares with anything that we've seen in the geologic record. And I could give all kinds of information about where we get this data from, but this chart right here shows us what atmospheric carbon dioxide levels have been like for about the past 400,000 years. And you can see on the chart, it says right on there, for the last even 650,000 years, atmospheric carbon dioxide has usually been below 300 parts per million, or kind of maxing out at about 300 parts per million. And what we're seeing today is far beyond what we've seen in the geologic record. So we see global atmospheric carbon dioxide levels today that are over 400 parts per million. And specifically, the rate of that increase has occurred at an astronomical rate beyond anything that we've seen in the geologic record. So even when we look far, far back in time, to time that's millions or tens of millions of years ago, we've never seen carbon dioxide rise at this fast of a rate. And we know what kind of influence this has on climate when we look at carbon dioxide levels. So let's look at it on a more recent scale. So this is data that's been collected since the mid-1950s at Mauna Loa, which is of course in Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, far from any major urban population centers. And you can see there's variability in the red, goes up and down. Really, that's based on seasonal trends in carbon dioxide that occur in the Northern Hemisphere. And that really relies a lot on plant growth in the Northern Hemisphere. So in the summer, when plant growth is really high, plants are really happy. They're drawing a lot of CO2 out of the atmosphere, and the levels actually drop to a significant level. And then in the winter, as we're seeing now, not as much plant growth, and that CO2 level increases. So that's the variability that you're seeing. Overall, you can see on this chart, the overall trend is an increase in carbon dioxide over time. And again, that rate, when we look at it in a geologic perspective, is unlike anything that we've seen in the geologic record. So in case you're wondering, how fast is this increasing on a more, even more small time scale? We can look at the rate of carbon dioxide, and we're seeing an increase of about 2 parts per million per year. So as an example there, I have the rates for you from January of 2020, pre-pandemic, which seems like a hard thing to even remember what that was like. And then of course, January 2021, and you see the levels are about 2 parts per million higher. And that's that black trend line that you're seeing on the diagram, sort of the normalized trend over time, which is an increase. So every year, the highest point of CO2 gets higher, and every year, the lowest point of CO2 gets even higher. So why is this happening? Why are we seeing CO2 increase on this human time scale and on a time scale that's so much beyond what we've seen in the geologic record? Well, we'll start by really briefly talking about the greenhouse effect, which I'm sure most of you have heard of before. It's this idea that we have gases in the atmosphere that are trapping this outgoing heat from the earth. So in the animation, you can see solar radiation coming from the sun, hitting the surface of the earth. Some of that is absorbed by the surface of the earth. Some of it is reflected back out to space. The heat that's coming off of the earth goes out into the atmosphere, and a lot of it is absorbed by gases in the atmosphere. And those gases include a wide variety of things, including carbon dioxide, as well as methane, and even water vapor is actually a really powerful greenhouse gas. So the more greenhouse gases we have in the atmosphere, the more of that outgoing heat is trapped. Kind of acts like a blanket to the earth, trapping that heat in. Now, the greenhouse effect is really important. If we didn't have our atmosphere and we didn't have the greenhouse effect, the earth would actually be too cold to support life. So it's a really important effect. What we're doing now, though, is we're throwing that effect out of balance. So let me give you an idea of what's happening. Since the Industrial Revolution, we've been burning fossil fuels at a higher and higher rate, an astronomical rate. Burning fossil fuels, of course, releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. And over time, our level of atmospheric carbon dioxide, as I showed you on the previous diagrams, has been steadily rising over time. Since CO2 is a really powerful greenhouse gas, more CO2 in the atmosphere means more of that outgoing heat is trapped. So the greenhouse effect is increasing, and the net effect of that, if more heat is being trapped, less heat is escaping to space, that means that the global temperature of the planet is increasing. Now, this isn't just a hypothesis. There is tons and tons of evidence to support this idea. Here's one chart from a group that was prepared by Berkeley Earth. This was an organization that was initially funded by a climate skeptic. They looked at a lot of the same data that organizations like the IPCC or the International Panel or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as NASA and NOAA, a bunch of organizations that I'm sure you've heard of here in the US. They've looked at this data at how temperature has changed over time. So this chart really shows you global temperatures from about 1860 all the way up through today. And again, what you notice over time is an increase in temperature. Overall, so far, the planet has seen a little less than 1 degree Celsius increase globally. Now, that may not sound like a lot. 1 degree Celsius doesn't sound like a ton, but as we're going to see, there's this thing called Arctic amplification. So the warming is actually higher in the polar areas of the Earth and in the Arctic. And so we're seeing a lot of really dramatic changes that are occurring. Again, I could spend all kinds of time talking about the changes that we're experiencing here in Wisconsin specifically, or in other areas of the planet. But of course, I'm going to focus my attention here for the purposes of today on what's going on in the Arctic. So another piece of information is, okay, so we've seen this overall trend in warming over time. What does that look like in just a shorter term schedule? So the warmest years on record in this long-term data collection period have been 2016 as the warmest. Last year was the second warmest year in the entire history of the record. The year before that was 2019. The year before that was 2015. The year before that was 2017. So it should kind of ring out to you that the warmest years on record are these years that are really recent. We're not seeing the warmest years on record be from the 1900s or from the late 1800s. These are recent. This is a recent trend in increase in temperature. So the map is showing you for the last full year where temperatures were higher. So reds are areas that were higher than average. Blues are areas that were colder than average. And you can see that there are some areas on the Earth that were actually colder than average. But on the whole, most of the planet is experiencing these warming trends. And a lot of areas on the planet are that really bright red, which are showing you record warm temperatures occurring just this past year in those areas on the planet. So I'd like to show you this animation because I think it does a really good job of highlighting just what these changes look like over time. So it's a quick 30 seconds. There's no audio. So I'll point out again, the blue colors are temperatures that are below average, and the yellows, oranges, and eventually reds are temperatures that are above average. And of course, in the middle of the animation here, you can see the year that's being shown on the chart or on the map. So as you can see over time, we're definitely noticing an increase in those oranges and definitely the reds over time. In particular for 2020, we're seeing a high increase in temperature over time. So this is a trend that's really picking up over time. All right, I'd like to focus in on what are some climatic changes in the Arctic. So as I mentioned previously, I'd like to narrow this down to 4 major factors, 4 major things that are changing in the Arctic. So the first thing I'll focus in is, okay, so we just talked about these global temperatures. Global temperature is a little less than 1 degree Celsius increase. So what does that look like in the Arctic? I mentioned this phenomenon called Arctic amplification, and that's the idea that in the Arctic, we're seeing greater changes than we are on the rest of the planet. So the Arctic is being affected more. It's kind of sometimes called like our canary in the coal mine. So what's going on in the Arctic should really alert us to things that are eventually going to happen to other latitudes on the planet. So on this chart, you can see a couple different things. So the red line is the warming that's been seen in the Arctic specifically, and the black line is the warming that's been seen around the globe. So you can see that black line over time, if you go all the way over to the right, which is 2020, a little less than 1 degree total of warming. When you look at the red line, which again is the Arctic, it's a little less than 2 degrees of warming. So when we look at the average just for the past year, and I'm specifying October 2019 to September 2020, that's the Arctic year. And the reason for that is because September is the end of their summer. And we don't want to, as scientists, essentially split the winter in two. When we end in December, we're kind of splitting the winter in two. And so that's the Arctic year. So for that year, the most recent complete Arctic year, surface temperatures were a little less than 2 degrees or 1.9 degrees Celsius above that long-term average. So you're seeing that Arctic amplification starting to show up here. Overall, the trend has been an increase in temperature over the last 5 decades, but certainly within the last 15 years is when we're really seeing that Arctic amplification showing up. So more than double that global average. It also, for the last year, was the second highest observed temperature anomaly for the Arctic since at least 1900. And you can see on the chart, there's one little spike that's a little bit bigger. That was the 2015-2016 year, which was the hottest recorded year on the planet. For those of you that are more of a heat map kind of person, this will work better for you rather than a graph. And so here's a map where you can visually see the temperature changes over the past year for the Arctic. Again, I'd like to kind of point out Greenland and Alaska and Canada so you can visually kind of think about what you're looking at. Again, blues or even whites are areas that were kind of right at temperature or below average. And then areas that are showing up as oranges or reds, those are areas that were above average. So a couple different things to notice on this map. Obviously, you see that on the whole, the area is warmer than average, but there's some really interesting trends here. Greenland, the Canadian Arctic, and Alaska actually experienced temperatures that were slightly colder than average over this past year, the past Arctic year, again, I'll specify. But areas like Siberia or the northern part of Eurasia are experiencing these temperatures that are record warm. So Siberia experienced temperatures that were 3 to 5 degrees Celsius. And for those of you who are not Celsius people, 5 to 9 degrees Fahrenheit above the average during their winter and spring for the past year. They had a record low June snow cover across the Eurasian Arctic and extreme wildfires. And I'll show you some photos of what those wildfires look like a little bit later. But I'd like you to kind of think about that because I'm going to talk about Greenland a little later. So remember that Greenland had this kind of unusual year in terms of temperature. So what about the temperature of the ocean? So that was the temperature of the land. What about the temperature of the ocean? I'll draw your attention to the map on the left that shows you mean sea surface temperature for August 2020. So basically the end of their summer season. In white, I've kind of added some text there to show you that the white is outlining the extent of the sea ice in that particular month. And then the colors are showing you the sea surface temperature over time. So what you can see is areas, again, pretty much anything that's showing up as a really dark blue or a black color is below average, and all of the other colors are above average. So on the whole, sea surface temperatures in the Arctic are 1.3 degrees warmer for this particular month for the end of the summer, warmer than the long-term average. So this has really big implications, particularly for sea ice. And that's my fourth category I'll talk about what's going on in the Arctic. So really profound impacts on the level of sea ice cover that's occurring. And I'll show you what that extent looks like a little bit later. Areas that warmed in particular are areas that kind of correlate with those higher temperatures. So the Laptev and Kara seas above northern parts of Eurasia had really record high temperatures for the year, up to 5 degrees Celsius warmer than the long-term average. So one of the questions is why is the ocean surface warming so much? And it really has to do a lot with reflectivity. So this diagram is kind of a simplified version to show you what happens when you have increased temperatures in an area with or without sea ice. So on the left, if you have sea ice, you can have as much as 90% of incoming solar radiation reflected back into space and only about 10% absorbed in the water. Now, I should say that 90% is if you're dealing with multi-year ice, which isn't something that we have a lot left of in the Arctic. Most of that multi-year ice has now melted. And so we're really looking at about 50 to 70% of that solar radiation that's being reflected back to space. It's still a pretty significant number. On the right, you can see what happens if you don't have any of that sea ice. The ocean surface is a lot darker, which means it's less reflective. It's absorbing a lot more of that incoming solar radiation. And a lot of that heat gets transferred to the water itself. So as much as 94% of that incoming solar radiation heat, that heat is being absorbed by the ocean. So it's kind of this positive feedback cycle where you have these warming temperatures, it's melting the sea ice. As the sea ice melts, it's causing the sea surface temperatures to increase, which is causing the ice to melt more, which is causing the sea surface temperatures to increase. You can kind of see how these feedback loops kind of cause additional changes. Okay, the next thing I'd like to talk about is permafrost. So just in case you're not clear on what permafrost is a subsurface layer of the earth that is frozen year-round. And this makes up about a quarter of the northern hemisphere, which is kind of crazy for us to think about, and definitely a large portion of Arctic coastlines as well. Permafrost is really, really important when we talk about climate change because it's incredibly carbon dense. That means that it holds a lot of carbon in it, as much as 10 times as much carbon as a boreal forest. So melting of permafrost and the release of those greenhouse gases and that carbon could be really problematic. So the permafrost, in terms of what we're seeing, I'm sure you can guess, there's an increase in areas of permafrost that are thawing, and I'll focus my attention specifically on coastal erosion. So on the left, you see a map. There are a lot of coastal areas in the Arctic that are made of permafrost. And unfortunately, these also happen to be the places where a lot of Arctic communities reside and where there happens to be a lot of infrastructure. Well, as that permafrost melts, because of increasing land temperatures or air temperatures, as well as increasing sea surface temperature, so the water hitting that coastal area is also warmer in addition to the air temperature, it's causing that permafrost to begin to thaw. And that's leading to increased rates of coastal erosion in a lot of places in the Arctic. So on that map, you can see the areas that are tan are pretty stable or even adding on. So a grading means adding on. And then all of those areas are different rates. So we've got orange and red and a really dark red showing you just how much erosion is occurring or what that rate of erosion is occurring. Obviously, it's occurring faster in areas that are made of more soft material, like you can see on the right, as opposed to areas that are more rocky or something like that. So the melting permafrost has other implications as well. Thawing permafrost releases greenhouse gases, and we won't spend too much time here, but there's information on that slide about those gases that are released. That includes carbon dioxide, and it also includes methane, and that can occur through methane hydrates, which is essentially methane that's frozen in crystals of ice. It can also include those gases that are within the permafrost soil itself, or that are held within the ice. So there's a lot of different ways that this is, again, another positive feedback loop where the permafrost melts, adds more greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, which then causes the temperature to warm and causes more permafrost to melt. This is a big, big concern moving forward because it has big implications for just how much warming we're likely to experience in the planet. So placing estimates on how much this will melt is really important. One more implication with permafrost is it's also led to an enhancement of the wildfire season in the Arctic. And in specific, for this past year, I'm trying to focus most of my attention on the past year. This is a map of all of the wildfire locations in 2020. there were recorded 18,591 separate wildfires reported in Russia, which burned a total of 14 million hectares. Now that's mostly in areas of permafrost. We've got a photo here so you can get a sense of the scale. And we didn't hear much about these in the news, but these were really catastrophic in the area. So here's one as it's burning. Here's an area that's been decimated by permafrost. Another issue with this, just to add to the terrifying nature of what's going on in the Arctic, is that this year we had evidence of these things literally called zombie fires. And they're called zombie fires because essentially what happens is there is permafrost that's literally smoldering underneath layers of ice and snow throughout the winter season. And what happens in the spring as that snow and that ice melts and that permafrost is exposed is it ignites these fires and basically gives them a jump start, allowing them to burn for longer and causing more damage. And again, positive feedback loop, the burning of these wildfires puts more CO2 into the atmosphere and causes additional issues there. So the third impact here is the Greenland ice sheet. Of course, the Greenland ice sheet is one of 3 ice sheets that we have on the planet currently. We have 2 in Antarctica, the West and the East Antarctic ice sheets. And then we have the 3rd in the Arctic, which is our Greenland ice sheet. There are lots of different ways that researchers study the Greenland ice sheet. It's actually absolutely incredible. They use satellite data to measure the amount of the ice melting, the thickness of the ice, glaciers coming off of the ice sheet and how fast they're retreating over time. So scientists also take ice cores into the ice, and that's where we get a lot of our past data about the amount of gases in the atmosphere. So they look at gas bubbles preserved in the ice to tell us information about what the atmosphere was like when that ice formed. So the Greenland ice sheet started forming about 3 million years ago. So we have a really long record, some really good information about what climate has been like and how this ice sheet has been impacted in the past. So this is a chart that shows you just from 2002 all the way to the present, what the Greenland ice sheet has been doing over time. And I'm sure you can probably guess where this is heading because temperatures have been increasing. Overall, we've seen a loss in ice mass over time. And throughout this record that I've shown on the chart, the average rate of loss is about 268 gigatons per year, which is a number that's hard for us to even visualize, but it's a lot. Essentially, the size and the thickness of that ice sheet is decreasing over time. You see a couple interesting things on that chart. You see a really heavy loss in 2019. 2019 was a really abnormally warm year in Greenland. And then you see the loss for this year is not as high. So if we look at the loss for this year, it's a little bit less. So it's higher than the overall average, but lower than that record loss. And the reason for that, if you think back to that map that I showed you earlier, is just because we have these slightly cooler than average temperatures in Greenland for the year. So when we look at this map, this is tying it more into 2020. So on the left, it's showing you the total melt over time or melt extent, as you can see, surface melt area. And so you can see in red 2020 or that 2020 Arctic year. And in 2012 was our really most extreme year of melt loss that we saw on the Greenland ice sheet. You can see they're both above that dashed blue line, which is the long-term average. And then on the right, you're really just looking at melting anomalies for certain areas. And you can notice that melting was more extreme in the northeastern and the southwestern parts of the ice sheet, which really just correlate to different changes in sea surface temperature, for example. Glaciers outside of Greenland, in case you're wondering as well, really continued their trend of significant ice loss, particularly in places like Alaska and Arctic Canada. Okay, so the next thing or the last climatic change in the Arctic that I'd like to talk about is sea ice extent. So you see just kind of a nice picture of sea ice on the left that's kind of breaking up. And then on the right, you see a photo or a map really that gives you an idea of what the sea ice extent was like for the end of this summer. That pink line is showing you that long-term average, so sort of a 30-year average of what the sea ice extent should be like at the end of summer in the Arctic. And of course, in white is the actual extent of that sea ice as of the end of this most recent Arctic summer year. So compared to that average, it's much lower. It's the second lowest end of summer sea ice extent that we've ever seen in the total satellite record. And it's really thought that these higher temperatures, those extreme higher temperatures in Siberia and sort of generally the northern Eurasian region that I showed you earlier really helped drive that loss of sea ice. But overall, we're seeing a continual trend. So let's look at some graphs. I'm a graph person. So we'll look at a couple of things with these graphs. The first thing I'd like to look at is looking at midwinter. So of course I had to include a polar, like no climate change talk is complete without an issue of a polar bear, a photo of a polar bear, but I didn't want to put a sad looking one in there. So I put a pretty healthy looking one in there. All right, so for midwinter, if we look at what the sea ice extent was like, there is definitely an overall trend at decline over time. So this is from January from 1979 all the way up to last month, or I guess it would be 2 months ago, January 2021. And you do see a decline in ice over time. So the slope is like -3% over time per decade. When we look at the end of summer, that's when we really see really strong changes in the amount of sea ice extent in the Arctic. So here you can see from the most recent end of summer, which would be September, all the way through September of 2020. And you see that decline is a minus of about 13% per decade. So we're seeing that increase much more rapidly. And that has to do with these big changes that we're seeing in this summer, really higher temperatures on land, as well as higher sea surface temperatures. There's a lot of debate over when the Arctic will become ice-free or sea ice-free. And most predictions are placing that sometime in the 2030s. And that's not ice-free year-round, mind you, but that would be ice-free essentially for the end of the summer. All right, so what are some of the implications of these pretty dramatic changes that are happening in the Arctic? And there are many. I'm going to focus my attention just on 2 of them. So the first one that I'll focus on are transportation routes. So if you're familiar with the Arctic at all, you might be aware that there are 2 different transportation routes that basically go between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean. One runs north of Canada and Alaska, or north of North America, and that's called the Northwest Passage. We hear about that a little more in the news, probably just because it's closer to home. So the Northwest Passage, actually, the history is really interesting because it helps us understand how much this area has changed over time. It was first explored in a pretty famous expedition in 1845 with 2 ships called the HMS Terror and the HMS Erebus. These ships were locked in the ice and all of the crew members ended up perishing because they couldn't escape the region. It was actually first traversed, and traverse means partially by boat and also partially by land, by an Irish explorer, and his name is Sir Robert McClure. I've got his photo on the left, in 1854. And it was first finally sailed by boat completely by a Norwegian explorer named Roald Amundsen. And he did this between 1903 and 1906. It actually took him 3 years to make the full traverse of the Northwest Passage. I'm bringing this up because I want to give you a really direct contrast with what's happening with the Northwest Passage now, and I'll do that on the next slide. On the upper right, you can see an example of a Canadian Coast Guard service boat from recent that was actually named after Amundsen. The second route in the Arctic is the Northern Sea Route. It's sometimes called the Northeast Passage, and this again goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean, but in this case, it actually goes over Eurasia. This was actually first sailed in 1879, but is still deemed to be really quite treacherous. So it's not nearly as open as the Northwest Passage. But last month, so February in 2021, a gas tanker and an icebreaker first traversed the Northwest Passage, or the Northeast Passage, in winter. And Russia put out a statement saying that year-round safe navigation is possible. This is something that was not even dreamed of a few decades ago or a few years ago. So the fact that that was traversed in February is pretty remarkable. So focusing on the Northwest Passage for just a minute, on that chart below, you can really see the heavy increase in traffic in the Northwest Passage over time. Now think about that history of how long it took for someone to actually traverse through and how it took him 3 years to actually make that passage. And now it's done by private yachts. If you look at the chart, it shows you just what kinds of boats and ships are actually making that passage. And a large proportion of them are private yachts, including, as you see in the photo, the mega yacht Latitude, which has actually traversed the Northwest Passage twice. You can actually book cruises now to go through the Northwest Passage. And the reason for this is because of that decline in sea ice. As more and more sea ice goes, and as more of that multi-year sea ice goes, it becomes easier and easier to traverse the Northwest Passage. Now that has pros and cons that are beyond what I'll talk about, but you can kind of get an idea that there can be really profound implications for this. Lastly, I'd like to spend some time talking about the geologic resources in the Arctic. As a geologist, this is something that fascinates me greatly. And the implications here are also pretty incredible. I'll try to focus for the most part just on what these resources are, but I'll talk a little bit about how different countries are dealing with this. So on this map, which is a little bit hard to see, essentially it's trying to show you the probability of undiscovered oil and gas fields with recoverable resources. Now, it is really difficult for us to evaluate what the resources are like in the Arctic just because it's a difficult place to be in. It's extremely cold. The sea ice can be hard to traverse. And a lot of places, it's really too deep for us to essentially use our technology to evaluate those resources. Nevertheless, the USGS, which is the United States Geological Survey, estimates that there are 90 billion barrels of oil, 1,669 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, and 44 billion barrels of natural gas liquids that still remain to be discovered in the Arctic. Again, most of these would be in offshore areas that would be in really harsh areas that would be really difficult for us to get to right now and actually not cost effective for us to obtain right now. But as the sea ice melts and as the temperature increases, those resources become more and more attractive. Now, one of the problems with this is who owns these areas. So there's something called an exclusive economic zone. An exclusive economic zone extends 200 nautical miles from the coastline of a particular nation. And within that exclusive economic zone, a nation owns the rights to all of the natural resources, the living and non-living natural resources. So that includes fishing, that type of thing for biological resources, and it also includes mining or obtaining oil. They can do whatever they want with those resources. They can use it for exploration, they can exploit those resources, or they can decide to conserve them. In case you're curious, this is the total EEZ for the United States. So you can see we have a large proportion of area around the continental United States on the west and the east coast, but we've also added quite a bit through Alaska. So we have a high proportion of EEZ located in Alaska, and of course that extends into the Arctic, and then a proportion of other areas around places like Hawaii and other US territories. So when we think about the Arctic, who are the players? Who's involved? So in black on this map, so again, we're kind of looking top down, so you can identify, it's got on there Greenland and Canada and Alaska. You can see in that black outlined area, what parts of the Arctic are actually, quote unquote owned or part of that EEZ. And the countries involved include the US, courtesy of Alaska, includes Canada, obviously. It includes Denmark, courtesy of Greenland, Russia, Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Iceland. So one of the things that's important to think about is that central area. That's where a lot of those allegedly undiscovered geologic resources are located. There's something called an ECS, and you can see that in supposed to be kind of like a purplish or bluish color, and it says Russian ECS proposed. So what does that mean? So that's an extended continental shelf. Essentially, any country can submit a claim that they would like to add to their EEZ. They would like to add this ECS. If they can prove that that continental shelf past the 200 nautical miles is a continuation of their own continental shelf, they can submit a claim to the UN. They can file a claim with the UN. And there's a commission on the limits of the continental shelf. And within that organization is basically a bunch of geologists and other scientists that make that evaluation. Now, they don't actually decide whether or not you can get that ECS. If there are different contest. So that's the big issue. When you have 2 or more countries that have submitted a claim to the same area, then that committee for the UN kind of makes that decision or kind of tries to decide, but then the countries still have to kind of battle that out, or not battle that out, hopefully, but kind of make a call as far as who owns that and try to come to a consensus there. One key thing with that is that if that's awarded, the ECS does not include the column of water above that continental shelf. So if Russia gained that ECS, they would gain access to all of the mineral resources in the continental shelf, but they would not gain access to the water column above. In other words, they couldn't do extended fishing in those areas and other things. So one of my favorite stories about the Arctic, and this is my last story here, is something called the Lomonosov Ridge. So the Lomonosov Ridge is an area in the Arctic that most of it right now is not part of any country's EEZ. It's not owned by any part of the country or any particular country. So on the map on the left, you can see that kind of brown bar that extends across the map. That's the Lomonosov Ridge. And the reason why it's being contested is because it's essentially thought to contain a heavy amount of oil or heavy amount of oil and natural gas resources. It's not really feasible to obtain those resources now, but countries are kind of looking ahead, thinking that at some point as sea ice melts, it will become more feasible. So there are 3 different countries that have submitted a claim to have their EEZ or their ECS, their extended continental shelf, extend to include the Lomonosov Ridge. Now, of course, one of those is Russia. They're essentially arguing that it's an extension of a Siberian archipelago that's called Franz Josef Land, which you can see on the map. And that seems kind of outlandish, but I'll mention that in a second. Denmark and then Canada have also argued that it's an extension of their properties, and you can kind of see how it actually extends to their continental shelf today. Now, the Lomonosov Ridge is actually really interesting geologically. If you see on the map on the right, there's this thing called a Gackle Ridge, and that is a seafloor spreading ridge. So that's part of the crust that's actually spreading apart. The Lomonosov Ridge actually used to be connected to the Siberian continental shelf all the way over to the east in this particular diagram. And so Siberia's argument, or Russia's argument, excuse me, is actually that it used to be connected to the Siberian continental shelf. So geologically, it's an extension of their continental shelf. Denmark and Greenland, Denmark and Canada are both arguing that it's essentially an extension of their continental shelf today. And so that's why they should gain access to it. So what's going on with this today is that Russia submitted a claim in 2001 to the UN. It was rejected. They were told to collect more evidence. Others then submitted competing claims. In 2007, you can see the photo on the right, Russia used a submersible to actually plant their flag on it at the site of the North Pole. And the Canadian foreign minister was really unimpressed with this. And he was quoted as saying, quote, "This isn't the 15th century. You can't go around the world and just plant flags and say, we're claiming this territory." So it didn't really go over particularly well. However, there's been some kind of treaties being signed. So in 2008, these 3 countries and a couple of others actually signed a declaration that committed to orderly settlement. So far, things have been really peaceful in the Arctic, but it will be really interesting. You know, there's been no conclusion on this. So it'll be really interesting to see where things move forward from here. All right, so in conclusion, few conclusions. The Arctic, of course, is drastically changing in response to anthropogenic or human-caused climate change, and it's changing even more than other parts of the planet due to Arctic amplification. For local land and ocean temperatures, of course, we're seeing those increasing and increasing at a rate faster than what we're seeing in the globe as a whole. The permafrost is thawing, and that's leading to a couple of different impacts, including, but not limited to, increased coastal erosion and an increase in the wildfire season in the Arctic. The Greenland ice sheet, we're seeing as a whole a trend of ice loss over time. So it's losing extent as well as thickness of the ice. And the extent of sea ice overall in the Arctic is decreasing, and we're seeing the biggest changes at the end of the summer season. So what kind of implications does that have? Many, many different human implications. And so I can try to end on some level of note of hope. In every prediction for the future, as far as how each one of these categories will change moving forward, what we do next matters dramatically. So yes, we are already locked into a certain amount of warming and a certain level of changes, But what we do next in terms of how we manage our carbon emissions moving forward will have a profound impact on just how drastic these changes will be, which will of course have a profound impact on humans moving forward. So I like to stress that at the end. That's my note of positivity, because we certainly can make a difference in what's going on in the Arctic. All right, I think this brings us to the point of questions and answers. So I will end there.
Rebecca, thank you very much. Lots to consider, lots to chew on, and we're starting to get some questions. Before we move to that, though, I would like to remind folks to please, if you have a question, put it in the question and answer tab, if you will, and we will get to those between now and when we conclude at 7:30. One of the first questions we did receive, actually from a St. Norbert alum, based on the forest wildfires Siberia has experienced, what could Wisconsin and the managed forests expect? How could this adversely affect the paper industry in Wisconsin?
That's a great question. So we don't have a lot of that long-term growth or that old growth forest in Wisconsin anymore. So that question kind of alludes to that we have a lot of managed forest that's been replanted. My colleague Nelson Ham actually deals with that issue quite more extensively. So I don't know how to comment on it too much. But definitely we will see an impact on our forests in terms of species moving forward. In terms of wildfire impact specifically, I'm not sure. What we're seeing in Wisconsin in terms of local impacts is an increase in temperature, but we're also seeing a really noticeable trend in an increase in precipitation in Wisconsin. And so that might have a dampening effect from a wildfire perspective, but is certainly having a negative impact from a flooding perspective. And we've seen that in the Green Bay area in the last couple of years pretty dramatically.
Thank you.
We have another question about the goals for this. And it says, do you think, and I think they mean here, perhaps the UN sustainability goals for carbon neutrality by a certain year is enough to slow the increase of global temperatures? And if not, what else could be done?
So that's a really good question. I think one of the things that was trying to be accomplished with the Paris Climate Accord was for us to limit our warming, ideally to within 1.5 degrees Celsius total. And I think a lot of scientists have agreed that we might potentially actually already be locked into that. Ideally, we need to limit our warming to below 2 degrees Celsius globally, because at that point, we see some really profound impacts that are essentially irreversible. At this point, we're locked into a certain level of warming. And what I always tell my students is your personal decisions have a big impact, but even bigger potentially, or even bigger than your individual impact and how you live, is your vote. A lot of things that need to be done are things that we can't do on an individual level, that we need businesses and governments to do. And that's to really limit our warming. Now we're doing some of these things. Green Bay and De Pere both have sustainability commissions that are working on lowering their emissions. St. Norbert has been really putting a good foot forward. And I know UWGB is doing some amazing things with sustainability as well. So on a larger scale, these are the types of activities that we need to have happening. These local efforts are going to have a really big impact over time as well.
Good. Another question relates to that concept of multi-year ice. And I was wondering, one of the questions is, could you maybe talk about that a bit more, explain what that is exactly and its impact on some of the phenomenon that you've been describing?
Yeah, I can absolutely do that. So essentially how sea ice forms in the winter, and it forms on the surface of the ocean, obviously. If that ice survives the summer sea melt or the summer melt, and so you could see on those maps, even for the end of September in the Arctic, there was still ice. If that ice survives the summer melt and then continues, it gets added on the next winter, and that ice will become thicker over time. That's what we call multi-year ice. So it continues to build over time, kind of like a glacier, only on the surface of the ocean. what we've been seeing as a trend over time in the Arctic is a pretty heavy loss of that multi-year ice. So that a lot of the ice that we're seeing is not, quote unquote, old ice anymore. A lot of it is really young. The problem with that is that it's thinner, which makes it more susceptible to melting. And so it's really kind of picking up the rates of melting that we're seeing in the Arctic over time.
Good. Thank you. David.
We have another question about rising water levels. And can you say a little bit about that? Is that the question here, is it just secondary and not one of the major worries, or is this going to be a serious impact of melting ice, sea ice in the Arctic?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and one that I just was like, I don't have time for this one. The increase in sea level is a really big concern. And I didn't talk about it for the Arctic, although a lot of what's going on in the Arctic will impact that. So sea level rise is not impacted by melting sea ice. Sea ice is already displacing as much water as it will. So when you melt sea ice, that doesn't just like magically add water to the ocean. What we're really concerned with is that melting of the ice sheets. So both Greenland and the two in Antarctica, as well as melting other land ice like glaciers or ice caps or those types of things. So melting of the Greenland ice sheet would be a really big concern. Or melting any of the ice sheets would be a really big concern. And that's not something that scientists will think happen in full or think will happen in full for quite a long time, if at all, if we're able to manage our carbon dioxide emissions. But to give you some context, if we totally melted the Greenland ice sheet, it would add 24.2 feet to global sea level. Global sea level, that's everywhere, not just in one local area. So yes, that will have a dramatic impact, or could have a dramatic impact. In terms of what we're seeing so far, looking forward, there was an article that was actually just published in Nature, the journal Nature, in September of 2020. And they were looking at moving forward, sort of a worst case scenario. If we don't do anything with our carbon emissions moving forward, we just continue to burn fossil fuels as is, they are predicting or estimating a melting rate of 600% faster than the current rate on the Greenland ice sheet. If we limit our warming to that 2 degrees Celsius that I was talking about earlier, they say that melting will only be 40% faster than the current rate. So what we do with these carbon emissions has a big role in how fast that ice melts, which then also has a big role in how much sea level rises. And obviously that has profound impacts because we have so many people that live in coastal areas that would be displaced by this. And we're already seeing sea level rise. I want to be clear about that. This is not just a future impact. This is something we are already seeing right now.
Good. Rebecca, there's a question. Please scale the effect of future greenhouse gas emissions. If we could reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 50% globally, would that stop the annual increase of mean temperatures, or just reduce the growth rate at a minimal amount?
That's a really good question. There's been a lot of research done on that to suggest that we're pretty locked into a certain level of warming right now. If we cut all of our emissions, yes, that will have a profound, extremely positive impact on the level of changes that we are going to experience or that we can expect to experience. One of the things that's interesting when we think about that, like, are we potentially locked in? A lot of researchers are looking at, we don't just need to cut our carbon emissions. We actually need to start doing things in terms of carbon sequestration. So we need to actually start pulling some of that excess CO2 out of the atmosphere that we've put there. So the stuff that we put there will be there for a very, very long time unless we do something to manage it. So we really have to deal with both scenarios right now. We're kind of relying on technology to advance to the point where we can do things with carbon sequestration. But yes, cutting carbon emissions is critical.
Thank you.
We have a couple questions about skeptics, climate change skeptics. One of them asking about volcanic emissions and how you can perhaps convince skeptics that there's a difference between volcanic emissions and industrial or human-caused greenhouse gases. And then another one about just some of the myths surrounding the environmental impact and what suggestions or recommendations you might have.
I didn't quite catch the second part of your
Well, the second one was just about, again, with skeptics, what might you say, or how can you counter some of these myths about skepticism?
Okay, so let me take the first part first. So we do know, from the geologic record, as a geologist, we do have evidence that volcanic eruptions can impact climate. Absolutely, they can. So for example, there was a massive, huge pyroclastic, devastating eruption of Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines in 1991 that put tremendous amounts of ash into the air. That ash actually circled the globe. So within a few months, we can actually trace aerosols from that eruption had completely circled the planet. That actually caused the global temperature of the planet to drop by as much as 1 degree Fahrenheit for 2 to 3 years following that one eruption. And that's purely because of the amount of aerosols put in the atmosphere that then circled the globe that kind of blocked some of that incoming solar radiation and caused the planet to cool. In other instances in the geologic record, we have evidence of massive, massive volcanic eruptions that may have actually contributed to mass extinctions because of the amount of greenhouse gases that they were pumping into the atmosphere. Now, at this point, we're talking about volcanic eruptions that are generating lava that's up to a mile thick. So this is not something that we're seeing today. We see volcanic eruptions today, and they can have a temporary impact on the climate. But what we're seeing is a long-term trend that cannot be answered by 1 or 2 volcanic eruptions, or even just the kind of steady rate of volcanic eruptions that we see over time. So that's my answer to the first part of the question. And my answer to the second part of the question is I would encourage people to look at the data. NASA has incredible information on their website. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has incredible information on their website. The IPCC, a group of scientists from 194 different countries around the planet. This is not just something that's like invented by scientists in America. This is a phenomenon that has been studied by scientists, and by the way, was actually predicted by science before we even knew that the temperature of the planet was starting to increase, that if we burn fossil fuels, the temperature of the planet would increase. So I would just encourage people to think about the fact that this isn't a conspiracy. It's not a debate among scientists whatsoever. So there's been a lot of research put into the papers, and looking at the papers, 97% of climate scientists, and these are the people who study the climate, agree that the climate is warming and that humans are the cause. And there was just a recent paper that looked at that 3% and found issues with the data and how they had analyzed that data. So this is not a debate in the scientific community whatsoever. Every major scientific organization supports this and provides evidence and data for it. So I would just encourage people to reach out and look at the data, look at the information, and look at the changes that are happening around you. It's here. It's not a future impact. It's happening right now.
So we're running out of time, but we have so many really good questions. So I'm hoping, Rebecca, we can do 2, and I'm combining a couple of these into the next 2 questions. So one is, you have talked about being locked into certain levels of warming. After 2 degrees Celsius, do the feedback loops you mentioned lead to the potential of further extreme warming, like 4 degrees Celsius or 6 degrees, for example?
That is one of the hypotheses about moving forward. So I couldn't have put it better myself. Those feedback loops, absolutely. So the melting permafrost, that's a big concern of how much carbon dioxide. Again, remember, it's super carbon dense. It contains a lot more, 10 times as much carbon as a boreal forest, in addition to methane. And that release of methane is really scary because methane is an even more powerful greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. So I think that's when people talk about locked in, that's really what it means, is we're already pumping so much CO2 into the atmosphere. It's already there. And then when some of those positive feedback loops really get moving, that's where we're kind of locked in.
Okay. Again, one last question, and a number of folks have raised the same issue. So do you expect CO2 levels to continue increasing at the same rate during the COVID-19 pandemic, or were you surprised to see it hold pace?
That's an excellent question. And I was wondering if someone would bring that up, because on my chart, when I showed for the last year, you don't even really see a blip in the level of CO2 that we measure at Mauna Loa. So there's a number of different reasons for that. I guess I was excited to see, as everyone was, when the kind of lockdowns went into effect. Obviously, that wasn't positive for a variety of reasons. I was really excited to see the trend in CO2. It will be down this year, and forgive me, I don't remember the exact percentage that it will be down for the past year for 2020. Unfortunately, it looks as though things really just picked up right where they left off. In terms of a long-term impact, there is a little blip in terms of how that CO2 is decreased during the pandemic, but the burning of fossil fuels really just picked right up where it left off. So what we really need people to do is use this pandemic as an opportunity to realize a lot of the things that they don't need to do that burn fossil fuels, and hopefully those patterns and those trends will continue forward in a positive way.
Good. All right, I'm keeping close eye on this, and I think unfortunately we are going to have to wrap things up because we could go on for quite some time given the questions coming in and Rebecca, your knowledge. So thank you very much for talking to us this evening about this critical issue. I was very glad to see that it was included in this year's issues for the Great Decisions lecture series, and I think we had a marvelous introduction to the ramifications of the problem, so thank you. Thank you to all participants. Really appreciate you joining us this evening. As a reminder, the recording will be available probably early next week. And our next Great Decisions lecture will be on the 17th. Will be on the end of globalization. That's a question mark. And again, Dr. Art Sear from Carthage College will be our speaker. In the meantime, thank you so much and have a good evening.